In my last video, I asked a few people I knew about what they saw on the streets of San Francisco regarding street safety, homelessness, and drug use. In this one, I'll be interviewing two people who are active in helping others get off the streets, becoming sober, and re-entering society. They both have experience going through addiction before, getting out of it, and healing from it. Now they work to help others do the same.
So my name is Tom Wolf. I'm a recovery advocate, and I'm the director of West Coast Initiatives at the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. I'm also formerly homeless, and I'm in recovery from heroin and fentanyl addiction. Well, in 2018, I ended up on the streets of San Francisco because of my addiction to heroin and later on fentanyl. Basically, ended up going through. I got addicted to drugs because I had surgery on my foot, and they prescribed me oxycodone for the pain, which is a synthetic opioid and a painkiller, and I got addicted to it. And from there, that spiraled into heroin addiction, and I basically got kicked out of my house because I was stealing and I was using drugs in the house around my kids, all these things. I bankrupted my family because I was using all the money that we had to buy drugs, and I ended up living on the street. And I finally got off the street because I kept getting arrested, and I had to go to jail for 3 months where I got clean, got off the drugs, and then I went to drug rehab for 6 months, and I've been clean and sober ever since. And it was that experience that motivated me to start speaking out about the drug crisis that's on our streets, the homeless crisis on the streets of San Francisco, why the things we're doing to try to combat those things are failing, and I try to explain the what they call the intersectionality between drugs, homelessness, and our criminal justice system, and housing, and how they all kind of have all four of them have all our policies around those four things have failed to actually solve the problem, and in fact, in many ways, have helped make it worse. And I've built up a whole national platform and audience now around this. It's taken me to the White House, where I've met with advisors to President Biden. I've met many congressional leaders, U.S. senators, policymakers in California and locally here in San Francisco to try to change our approach so that we're putting the focus back on holding people accountable for behavior like stealing, as an example, to support your drug addiction, and also to fund and expand drug treatment for people so people have a place to go, so they can get healthy again and get off the drugs and kind of make a new life. That is still probably the most common way. I'm not sure if it's the most common way anymore, but it certainly used to be like in the 90s and early 2000s. The United States had a real problem with the overprescription. We overprescribed painkillers to people, and a lot of people, like around 20 million people in the United States, got addicted to opioids of some kind, OxyContin, as a result of that. Um, One of the main drivers, though, of addiction underneath that are things, there are actually many factors. One of them is like early childhood trauma, like you grow up in an abusive household, or maybe you grew up in the foster care system, or maybe you grew up in a house where your parents were alcoholics or drug addicts, and those things can carry over to the next generation. That also helps drive drug addiction. Another thing that helps drive addiction is socioeconomic factors. While addiction itself doesn't discriminate, if you're, let's say, struggling in poverty, and life is really difficult for you, there's a higher prevalence in many cases of people self-medicating to try to escape some of those challenges that they're facing, economically, and that can also lead to addiction. And then there's just people in general that have what they call a predisposition to addiction. I think a predisposition to addiction, that means you're more likely to get addicted to a substance than not. I think a lot of that is genetic. Like I come from a family where there's three members of my family that were alcoholics. So I had the predisposition to become addicted to drugs. It just manifested with opioids, with painkillers instead of alcohol. So I think that's the case for a lot of people as well. So there's not one primary thing. But yeah, sometimes prescribing medications can get out of hand if you don't use those drugs as directed. And that's the main thing. Like with me, I didn't use the drugs as directed. I took more than what I was supposed to be taking because I was in pain, and also it was making me high at the same time. So you put those two things together, and I liked it a lot, and that's how I ended up addicted. Oh, wow. Well, I think there's more drug users in San Francisco now than ever before. That recently in the Department of Public Health released some data that suggested that there are maybe up to as many as 37,000 hardcore illicit drug users in San Francisco. And then at the same time, you have somewhere between 8,000 and maybe up to 20,000 people that experience homelessness at one point or another during the course of the year. And based on, depending on what data you look at, and there's lots of different data points around homelessness and drugs and what role drugs play in homelessness. Conservative estimates suggest about half of all the homeless are addicted to drugs. Other estimates, including a 2019 study from UCLA, suggests that up to 78% of people on the street experiencing homelessness are struggling with what they call a substance use disorder or drug addiction and a mental illness or both, a combination of both. Okay, so there's a few different things. I'm glad you asked it that way. So there's no one thing. Okay, most homeless activists will tell you there's a lack of affordable housing. That's what drives homelessness. But there's also an equal amount of priority and need uh, is a drug crisis, an unabated drug crisis, unquestionably happening in San Francisco, and the data bears that out. In that, um, for example, over a span of 5 years, the San Francisco Sheriff's Department, processed about 80,000 people that got arrested and came through the Sheriff's Department, came through county jail in San Francisco. And out of that 80,000 people, uh, like 80% of them had a history of substance use, right? And then at the same time, San Francisco is the most expensive, or maybe the second most expensive city to live in the entire country. So it's not just affordable housing, it's the cost of groceries, food, uh, eating out, all those things, gas. You factor all those issues of affordability together, and you have kind of this perfect toxic storm of living in a city that's way too expensive for most people, and drugs are widely available and very cheap, and we have a very lax law enforcement approach to people who use drugs on the street, because even if they get arrested by the police and they go into the court system, the majority of those people get put into what they call mental health diversion, which is supposed to be a vehicle to get people into treatment. But what ends up happening is they just get released and go back to the street and continue to use. So it's really kind of a really kind of a bad loop that people get caught in when they're out there on the street using drugs and being homeless. Yeah, and so nobody ever gets better, basically, is the problem, right? What you want to do is people that are experiencing homelessness and using drugs at the same time, you want to get them off the drugs, and housing them alone isn't enough. And again, the data supports that claim in that in San Francisco this year, so we're at the end of July now, right? This year so far in San Francisco, about 30% of all the people that died of a drug overdose died in what they call supportive housing or subsidized housing. And overall in the city, 70% of all overdose deaths that happened last year and the year before and this year too. So now we're talking about over 1,500 people. 70% of them died at a fixed address, which means they died inside, not on the street, like everyone assumes. So what we're doing is our policy is that we're going to make housing really low barrier for people. We're going to take them off the street and put them in a hotel room and call it housing as an example. The problem is that a really high percentage of those people are dying within 1 year period of time from overdose of drugs because they're using a loan inside that hotel. There's no easy way to answer like, well, this is what's happening, this is what's happening. The bottom line is that the there's drugs that are legal, like alcohol and weed, marijuana, right? And there are drugs that are illegal, like fentanyl and meth, right? And the problem is that there's a lot of people that really like the way fentanyl and meth makes you feel. So there is a demand for those drugs. And so people fill that demand by creating those drugs and smuggling them into the United States, or sometimes making those drugs themselves in the United States, and then distributing them into cities, and then drug dealers sell those drugs. The argument from the harm reduction side of this is that, well, we should legalize all those drugs too, just like alcohol and weed. The problem with that is that more people die every year from alcohol, which is a 100% legal drug, than any other drug put together, right? So legalizing it really isn't the answer because a ton of people are going to die anyway, and even more people as young as you are going to now have easier access to things like fentanyl and meth, which are drugs that are absolutely debilitating at a much quicker rate than alcohol. So like people can be alcoholics and you could drink for 40 or 50 years. And finally, after 50 years, your liver gives out and you die, right? But fentanyl, all you have to do is use it once and you can overdose because it's so strong that it shuts down your nervous system and your respiratory system and you stop breathing and that's it. So it's almost like comparing apples and oranges. But basically, the majority of the drugs in San Francisco come are cartel backed. They're smuggled up into the Western United States from a couple of different cartels in Mexico. And in San Francisco, they're primarily sold on the street by organized drug dealers working indirectly for those cartels, selling fentanyl, meth, and crack cocaine on the street. Last year, for example, in the Tenderloin neighborhood, the police seized 90 kilos, so 230 pounds of fentanyl off the streets last year, which is just a crazy amount when you think about it. And they had told me that they think that that was only about 10% of what actually was out there on the street. So there's so much drugs out there in San Francisco. It's made the price go down so that now you can buy fentanyl for as little as $5 on the street in San Francisco. And it basically has become like a beacon for drug users and homeless people who are also drug users across Northern California and up into Oregon and Washington and Idaho and all that Arizona to come to San Francisco for the cheap drugs, the plentiful drugs, and the fact that not a whole lot happens to you if you use drugs on the street. That's the truth. That's the reality. That's why San Francisco has 700 overdose deaths every single year. No, in fact, most people that are offered help on the street turn it down. So, last year there was a big Supreme Court ruling called Johnson versus Grants Pass. That was the name of the case. Uh, and and people argued that sweeping homeless encampments was a violation of the homeless's Eighth Amendment right. Right? It was cruel and unusual punishment. But the Supreme Court disagreed with that, and so the sweeps were allowed to resume. And what they found is that when they would go and do the sweeps in San Francisco, they would offer everybody on the block, a shelter bed, right? So let's say there was 100 people on the block, and they were saying, "Hey, we have a shelter bed for you right now because you need to move. You can't keep camping out here on the street anymore." 90 out of those 100 people turned it down. And then you have to ask, why are they turning it down? Well, again, homeless activists will say that it's because shelters aren't a good place. But the reality is that the majority of those people on the street are using drugs. And they know that if they go stay in the shelter, it's harder for them to obtain and use drugs. So they don't want to go to the shelter. Uh, in my own experience of being homeless, I went to a shelter. I stayed there for 3 days, and I eventually left the shelter because it was one too far away from where I used to score my drugs on the street, and two, it was too hard for me to use drugs in and around the shelter. So I didn't like it. So I left to go back out to the street. where I could continue to use drugs freely.